Dum-dum. Hello everyone. Welcome to the YouTube channel for All Saints with Holy Trinity for your weekly deep dive into the scripture readings for Sunday. Well, the Revised Common Lectionary scripture readings, other scripture readings are available, but this is a little weekly conversation where I meet with three other preachers, ministers, those who grapple with the scriptures and might be perhaps they might be preaching on Sunday, or if they're not, we just do it as like an imaginary exercise, or maybe they're leading a small group or whatever it is, but who engage with the scriptures and seek to understand what God is saying to us in the here and now. So I can't see anyone in the chat at the minute, but that's fine. We just like to start, and you never know who might join us. But if you are watching live on this Tuesday lunchtime, we would love you to join in with the conversation. So do please say hello in the comments and join in. Tell us what you think. What are the questions that are raised for you by these scriptures? Where do you find encouragement? Where do you find challenge? What kind of sermon would you like to hear preached on it, or what kind of sermon would you preach? So that's the kind of format. So yeah, you'll know we do this a lot, so we kind of got a little pattern going on. So I'm going to introduce my guests to you. I shall reveal them to you by the magic of my lovely gallery button. Familiar faces, they've all done the Muse before. So while I type up into the comments the passages that we're looking at today, so you can grab a Bible or open up your app and have a look, they will tell you a little bit about who they are and introduce themselves to you. So can you take it away, folks? Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Natalia Nana. I am based in London and I work in the field of diversity and inclusion for a heritage charity. So I really approach scripture and Bible reading and my relationship with God through a very decolonizing, critiquing, questioning, inclusive lens. And that's what I'll be doing today.
Hello, I'm Kat, and I am based in the Diocese of Leicester. I'm a fairly new intercultural pioneer minister here in the city, and that involves bringing together people from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds to chat about culture and faith and life and how those things link up together. And so I like to read the Bible through that lens. And Wendy was asking as well earlier, just before we went live, how we react to snow. And so I have to say, I love seeing snow, and I love snow for like the first day or two of it existing, and I love playing in snow. But as soon as it starts to turn to like sludge and ice, just don't want to go anywhere near it, because I'm terrified of driving in the snow and like accidents that happen and being cold for prolonged periods of time. So that's my response to snow. I like being warm.
Hello, my name is Sue Wallace and I work for a charity called Transcendence, which writes resources and helps churches who want to start new things, creative worship, and oh gosh, what else? Consultancy with people who want to start new things, and some liturgical training, but that's mostly online at the moment. Before I did this, I was a cathedral presenter, so I used to be at Winchester, and before that I was up at Leeds being a presenter, but also starting Fresh Expressions in the city centre. So creativity, new, old, worship, multimedia. So I often read scripture with multimedia eyes, I suppose, and imagery and the multisensory nature of it all, actually.
Thank you, Sue. And tell me about you and snow. Have you been making snowmen, or have you been snuggled at warm?
We haven't really had quite enough to make a snowman. One year I made a snow dog.
It's the creative in you. You see, it's the creative.
Yeah, because I drive a smart car. It's really, really green and lovely, and I've got an electric one now, but it's not very good in the snow because they're so light. It's quite nice to be all cozy and locked up inside.
Excellent. And what about you, Natalia Nana? Are you a snow fan?
Yes and no. I'm more to Kat's persuasion of I woke up and saw it was snowing. I was like, oh my God, this is so beautiful. This is amazing. And we had it was just green grass. And I was like, come on, bring more snow. And then the flakes got bigger and I was on my sofa with my beautiful cup of tea and just enjoying it. I didn't go out in it. I'm not mad. The world is telling you it's not a good place to be outside. Why would you voluntarily don clothing and enter it? I'm like, no, I got over that when I was 10. I'm now just like, this is the best for you. So yeah, I touched it when I put the bins up. I was like, come on, you've got to touch the snow while it's here. Okay, I'm over that, back inside.
Well, there you go. Welcome to this week's lunchtime take on the weather. Well, we are engaging with the scriptures today, and we're not just going to look at them through the window. We are going to dive in and immerse ourselves in them. And everyone here brings their different perspective and their different lens to it, and we encourage you to engage with us. So our scriptures today, the Revised Common Lectionary gives you two choices for this Sunday. If your church follows that liturgical theme, some churches will stay with Epiphany 4, the fourth Sunday of Epiphany, and keep unpacking the themes of Epiphany that way. For us at All Saints, so hence for the Muse today, we've gone with the second choice of readings, which is either called Candlemas or the Presentation of Christ in the Temple. And I love doing it like this. I've adopted this pattern, I guess, over the last 10 years. I like doing this, and partly I like doing it because it's a chance to recapitulate all the themes of Christmas. So if you've been with us the last few weeks, if your church follows the Epiphany seasons of readings, you'll know that yeah, we have Christmas Day, but actually we keep doing Christmas in different ways over these weeks in January. We keep unpacking what it is that this incarnation is about. So the lens through which we come to the readings today is through the gospel reading, the story of the presentation of Christ. So about 40 days after the birth of Jesus, this custom of taking the baby to the temple, and we have this passage where we get Simeon and Anna, and we get a piece of scripture that comes out in the liturgy, certainly of the Church of England, in a service called Evensong. Some of you will know that service, called the Nunc Dimittis, words that are set to music. So that's the context for our readings today. I think Kat's going to kick us off as we take a look to start with at the gospel reading, which is Luke chapter 2, verse 22 to 40, I think, no, to 38, no, to 40. It does go to 40. Jesus grows up, which is an important part of the story. Kat, when you read this, where do you go when you look at this?
I love this passage. There's so much packed in there, and it's just so full of stuff, and it's really fast paced, and that's something I really love about it. I love the first thing that comes to mind is the comparison between Simeon and Anna and their responses to meeting Jesus. And that, I've heard that preached about so many times, and so it gets a little bit repetitive, but I just love noticing again and again the ways that they respond to Jesus, and but also imagining what I would have felt like if I were in the shoes of Mary and Joseph in that moment. If I had taken my young, basically newborn child into the temple for this exciting ceremony, I'd probably be a bit nervous being in this big space with all these posh robed priests doing their thing and whatever else, not necessarily very comfortable, and just feeling a bit strange. And then this slightly odd old stranger comes and takes the child and holds it up and starts saying some odd things. I'd be thinking, what the flip? But also noticing how Simeon's response to Jesus is like, this is great, celebrate it. Okay, I can go and die now because God has promised me that I will see the Messiah before I die. Now I've seen the Messiah, so I can go and pop it. And then Anna's response is quite different. Anna's response is, we need to share this. Like, look, the Messiah has come, and she goes around telling everyone in the temple who is interested. So I found that really interesting, just seeing that there's different responses in our own lives. How do we choose to respond to Jesus? Is it something that's inherently so personal that we don't want to share it, that we can, take it to the grave? Or is it beyond that, and as well as being a deeply personal thing, something we'd like to share with people? So that struck me from the passage. And it reminded me, I love how Luke's gospel does this throughout the gospel. He sort of compares the male-female response at times. And this seems like a bit of an example of that, almost like Luke is saying, oh, look at this old guy. And the way that he responds is a little bit maybe almost silly compared with, I don't want to say this, prophet is a silly person, but just sort of comparing, scrap that, comparing with the way that Anna responds. I found that quite interesting, and quite like a bit of a paradigm shift for the readers maybe, and a bit of a challenge. And the light for the Gentiles thing is massive. That line about Jesus being a light for the Gentiles that would have been another paradigm shift, another like, okay, the Messiah isn't just for the Jews, isn't just to rescue Israel from the Romans, but actually for the whole world. And that's huge. And as well, the thing about, there's two comments at the end. Sorry, I'm flitting about all over the passage, but just my brain is doing that today. lockdown brain. The two comments about Jesus growing and, you know, growing in wisdom and stature, and that to me rings bells with Samuel, and how there's the two comments about Samuel growing in wisdom and stature and favor with God and with men, which I found quite interesting. And then right back at the start of the passage, Mary and Joseph bringing Jesus in with pigeons for the sacrifice, which is something that only people really in poverty brought for their sacrifice, as we see in kind of the Old Testament passages about this ceremony, when God was sort of setting up this as a practice, as a tradition, which gives us quite an insight into, we don't necessarily always think about Jesus in the context of poverty, and it is mentioned sometimes, but in the world of our sort of middle class Anglicanism, often we can kind of forget that, and forget that Jesus wasn't in that world at all, and so I find it really helpful just to notice things like the pigeons, that and what that means in terms of the context of Jesus' life, and who he came to speak to and to be with, and what does that mean for us in our faith and in our living with God. Yeah, and a sign that will be, so Simeon's thing about Jesus being a sign that will be spoken against, what verse was that? Verse 34. I found that really interesting, thinking what does that mean for Jesus' life and death, and people's reactions to him, and our reactions to the way that Jesus might challenge us nowadays, and you know what that looks like in terms of social interaction outside of the church, and just sort of thinking about that and grappling with that, I found really interesting as I was kind of praying about this. So that's sort of where I'd go with the passage, jumping over all over the place. But
thank you. So there's so much in this, and you've touched, I think, on so many of the different threads and where you could go with this as a preacher, because there's like you said, there's putting Jesus in his very human family. We've got the context of this boy growing up, and then we've also got the little detail of the pigeons and so on. But then we've also got the whole thing of the prophetic voices of Simeon and Anna. And I know, you touched on it at the start as well. Luke often does this. He pairs male, female parables together. So you get the man, you get the woman, you get the more attention to women. And somehow, always as a preacher, it's our job to amplify Anna's voice, because the tradition we don't have Anna's words, but we just have this praise response. In the comment,
can I add as well?
Oh. Yeah, go.
It struck me as I was reading this just earlier today, that actually when we read this passage, and we read it quite because we've heard it so many times at Candlemas, at the presentation of Christ at the temple, it's a really familiar passage. But when I was reading it yesterday, it struck me that Simeon and Anna were known to be kind of prophets in their own circle within the temple, and there's often a narrative that we hear in churches of God didn't say anything between the Old and the New Testament in that period of 400 years or however long it was. God was silent effectively, and actually this shows us that he wasn't. He was speaking to people all the time, because if that wasn't the case, why weren't these two either on a pedestal or kicked out? God's voice was known, and that kind of strikes me in a time of lockdown and things as well. I'm thinking when some people are saying God feels really absent, actually he's not, and where can we sort of notice that and listen for his voice in the everyday things that are around us?
Where are we?
I throw that in there.
Where are we listening? Where are we tuning in? Sue, I wanted to bring you in, because obviously some of these words, sung a lot. You mentioned your intro as well. Presenter at a cathedral, bit of a big thing, even songs at cathedrals.
Yeah.
Is that when you hear this? Is that where you go? Do you hear the music, or is that a distraction? Or is it helpful?
Sometimes. I mean, it's so lovely seeing it in its context, the dual in its setting. I think there's a few things really. I mean, like Kat, I spotted the whole pigeons thing, but I was reading up, and the really interesting thing about the pigeons were not the offering for abject poverty. They were the offering for ordinary people. There was one offering below that, which was grain. So they weren't in desperate poverty. They were just ordinary. And there's something lovely about God coming into the ordinary. But I think the other thing for me, I suppose, with a precentorial hat on, thinking of the temple and this big worship space and how that big worship space was organised and ran, the thing that I suppose struck me this time was the whole thing about the temple was there, and it was a gorgeous space, but the Jewish people had lost the ark. And there's a whole thing in the Orthodox tradition about Mary being the new ark, because she carries Jesus within her. She carries the very bread of life within her for 9 months. And so she becomes the new ark. And this weird thing that the new ark is coming to the temple, and yet the temple doesn't let her in until she has been purified. And yet, so until they've kind of slaughtered the pigeons and sprinkled the blood and purified her, but she doesn't need purification from anything. And yet she's buying back this person who is actually the one who is going to buy us back. So there's a whole load of wonderful juxtapositions and irony going on, actually, in the Lord is coming to the temple, and that is Jesus. He's coming because the temple has been empty because they've lost the ark. So there's some wonderful things happening in this passage, and the wonderful arrival of Mary into this space, and Joseph and Jesus. Yeah, so it's exciting and wonderful, but I should probably shut up now.
That's right. And I wonder, yeah, where you go to that in worship, and how you how you dial into that. Lots who've been joining in. I'm going to come to you in a minute, folks at home. There's quite a few of you here. Hello. Vanessa just says, reminds me of the ordinary Mary and Joseph being changed into extraordinary, references to the water and wine miracle story that we had last week. Natalia and Anna, let me bring you in. You've been listening to Kat and to Sue. When you read this story, what's grabbing you at the minute?
Yeah, I find it interesting, again, having that comparison, or not even comparison, having the inclusion of women and men. I think a few like nitpicky points that come to me because I'm such a pedant of, it doesn't say that Mary and Joseph offered pigeons. It says they either offered doves or pigeons. So we actually don't know there like which one they went with. But I love that, again, as a point of inclusion, of just showing, okay, the whole point of the temple system as God introduced it was to be inclusive, was to be, okay, whether you're bringing grain, whether you're bringing a goat of the best unblemished kind or a bull, you're welcome here. This is your space. And I love the fact of, again, it's actually Anna who's named a prophet. Simeon isn't. Simeon's, called a righteous man, and he's devout, but he's not a prophet. It's Anna who actually is the one who's given that title, giving that term of respect, and actually showing her dedication in a way that isn't as perhaps articulated, whether that be because she didn't say it in a way that was recorded, or whether it be sexism that it didn't get included. I think I'll pick up on a point that Kat raised. I think I want to give it a different cultural lens. If I don't think Jesus would have been overwhelmed and that the parents would be surprised, in part because it says that the child's father and mother were amazed about what's being said. So it doesn't sort of imply that they were like, who is this old guy and why has he got our kid? I just think it's important to read this through a lens of Israeli culture. As a child, as a Ghanaian child, I'm used to being passed around to your elders. It's normal that people who are strangers, as you'd call them in England, extended family or communities, we'd call them for the majority world. I think it's important to not impose that 2.4 nuclear position. So chances are Mary and Joseph would have lived with extended family. They almost certainly would not have just lived with themselves and their child at this stage. So it wouldn't have been at all surprising that people were picking up the baby. And I think that is borne out when we then see how Yeshua is lost and he's still at the temple when he's 12. And that, again, is because of the Jewish culture of you don't know where your kid is at all times because your kid's in the community. So they would have assumed, oh, he's just part of the caravan. Oh, he's with Auntie Sarah, such and such, and da-da-da-da-da. And then it's like, oh, crap. Wait, he's not? Oh, well, you haven't seen, when did you last see him? Oh, 3 days ago. Okay, we need to go back for our kid. Here, social service would be called. In majority world culture, that's just family, that's community. So I celebrate this as just another reminder of Yeshua being part of, he's embodied. Again, we're seeing that he was physically, he was physically circumcised, he was physically purified and going through these customs. B, it really anchors him in Jewish culture and Jewish tradition, which the Anglican Church has got a lot to answer for, and the westernization of it has really just, whitewashed that. And he's a brown working class lad. He was just a brown working class lad in a brown majority culture of family, of community, of tradition, of song, of so many things that actually English culture isn't, and that when we do engage with them, I think we're all enriched by. So I love the inspiration and the gender neutrality and wider inclusion and celebration of this story.
Thank you. I love what you said, really struck me about belonging in the community, which, yeah, you're quite right, is a lens that we don't quite have Yeah, that kind of like, yeah, I'm always losing my children. I was always using them at Greenbelt, which is a festival that many of you will know. They were usually fine. There's lots and lots of comments that have come in. Some folks in the comments have been talking a little bit about what's going on with Anna, and Chris, hello Chris, raised the point, fasting and prayer as evangelism. I wonder how thin the line between public prayer and observance and virtual signalling is. Any thoughts? That's a really interesting take. And Helena says, Chris, back to Chris, depends what the public prayer is and what function it has. I think because of time, we might just leave that one hanging for a minute. We might come back to it. And then also some lots of comments about the Holy Spirit being at work. And then, yeah, loving what you said, Sue, about the idea of Mary as the new ark, and the ark coming back into the temple. How are we doing? Yeah, I'll tell you what, let's just leave this little synopsis hanging for a minute, because I think we'll come all the way back round again, and I want to do justice to the other passages, and we'll come back to prayer and evangelism and virtue signalling question perhaps nearer the end. Good question, Chris. Let's go to Malachi next. Who was picking up Malachi? Sue, is that you, or is that Natalia and Anna?
Oh, I think it might.
Sue, I think it's you. I think you're on Malachi first.
Right. Okay. Yes. Malachi. Yes. I used to read Malachi, and I used to see the fire, and kind of gloss over it in flames, don't like flames. Flames like burning up in judgment and destroying. And actually looking at it this week, I realised that just isn't the case. This is a refiner's fire. It's not a destroying fire. And so if we're thinking silver or gold and burning up the ore, what happens is that the silver floats to the surface and all the yucky stuff sinks to the bottom. And then they scoop out the silver and purify it. So actually it's more about becoming pure and becoming holy and becoming washed. And the washing symbolism is in the sheep as well, the fuller's soap. So again, I was reading up about that, and it's fascinating. They used to take these fleeces, and there were three things that used to happen. There was the fuller's soap, and there was the fuller's earth they sometimes used to use, and there was also rancid urine that they used to use to wash these things. So they used to wash these things and beat them, but actually what came out as a result, and rinse them, what came out as a result was really pure white fleece. And what I saw in that was actually our experiences in life and lockdown, that we might feel like, we're being weed on, we're being beaten, we're being thrashed, we're being crushed, but something inside us is being purified. And this idea that all these horrible experiences can make us better people, I found that in the passage, that hope in the passage, really, for me.
The gunk coming out, as it were. Chris in the comment says that Malachi prophet. I don't know whether Chris wants to do his top, your list of proper prophets, Chris. Listening to it today and reading it today at morning prayer, for those who follow the common worship rhythm of liturgy for morning prayer, we're reading Hosea, and of course all of these what we would call minor prophets, but they play a slightly different role in a Jewish reading of the Hebrew scriptures, but they kind of have these themes that run together, particularly these themes of judgment, and again, judgment against injustice. That it is just the stuff that really leaps out at me, which I can sort of see as being grim stuff that needs to be sucked out. I loved it. I wouldn't do that as a visual aid personally, but maybe you would. Maybe that's what you were thinking.
No, the reason these places were outside the town was because they stank.
Oh.
Good source of water, and just a little bit further away from my backyard.
V raises a question in the comments. She says, what does becoming pure mean though? And I guess how we understand that might really shape how we would preach it. And I think perhaps all of us on this call would wrestle with something that gets called purity culture and wouldn't want to be preaching in that direction. But I don't know, I wonder if we can reclaim the notion of becoming pure out of this passage and how we might preach it. Natalia, Nana, let me bring you in on this little Malachi passage.
Sure. Any shout out to purity culture on there. I love this passage. I love both the Old Testament passages. I was thinking about purity and how so much of English and Western culture is just like purity equals sex and swearing. And that's pretty much, and maybe alcohol and cigarettes. Like, it's just so reductive and limited and restricted and Victorian. I'm like, I don't think that's what they're actually on about. And yeah, for me, I'm more looking at this sense of purification and refinement, and yeah, that sort of separating from the dross, from the gold, from the silver, from what you want to keep. And I'm seeing it more as like the image of, say, like Matryoshka dolls, that refinement of God helping me become the Russian dolls that you take one off and then you get, you know, into those Matryoshka, sorry, dolls. But that, like, as a type of purification, of like the purification being a distilling, I'm trying to get down to as pure, as in as refined, as essence of who Natalia Nana is really made to be. It's really made to be in her fullest, truest, most authentic self. So another word for righteousness is genuineness. And same when we're looking at judgment, I'm like, well, what does it mean to judge something? It means many things. It can mean to judge it as in a court of law, like, is it good or bad? This moral judgment and a sense of punitiveness. And there's a sense of judging just as in weighing up, evaluation. I'm being judged when I have an examination, when I have a CPD, when I do a test. There's a sense of judging something as in like, what is it worth? What's it made up of? What's its components? A sense of judgment as evaluation. And that really speaks to me of, okay, like righteousness as evaluation, the sense of God judging me, not with this fearful, oh my God, am I a sheep? Am I a goat? But more of the judging me, what needs to be pulled off, what needs to be refined, like Eustace in that fantastic Chronicles of Narnia, what needs to be sort of like peeled through. But then I also would widen that out systematically, because I think too much the Church of England has too much of a, oh, don't say that phrase, you're on the churchy thing, too much of a commitment, a bugbear, proclivity for focusing on the individual, of this individual sin, individual salvation, individual refinement, what's coming out of me. And so many Western church songs, and the danger of that is then, because of colonialization, Western songs now dominate all cultures. In Africa, they're singing Hillsong in the same way that we are in America and Britain. I is the most common word. Like, now the amount of we and the amount of actually the word, like the name Yeshua, Jesus, being used has really reduced in the last 50 years. I'd say, you know, quite disconcertingly so. But actually looking at this, it's a we. It's looking at the system, it's looking at judgment, it's looking at who you're oppressing, the workers, the wages. So you've got this sense of the people who are oppressed as a group of identity. So yeah, it's orphans, it's widows. Nowadays, like, well, nowadays that would be people of color. Nowadays, that would be people who are seeking asylum, or who are immigrants, people who are key workers, or who are on low wage and not giving the living wage. Where is the church's voice on that? Where the church's voice on BLM, on LGBTQIA inclusion, on systematic oppression? And I think for me, when I noticed the fact that they've labeled sorcerers, adulterers, those who swear falsely, I was like, I don't really think Malachi is going on about adultery specifically or sorcery specifically. Get over it. I think reading Harry Potter is fine. I think the point is deceitfulness. I think the point is deception. That's what those three, so I demarcated it as, okay, swearing falsely, adultery, and sorcery. You're manipulating people, you're deceiving people. That's one thing. And the others is oppression, is exclusion, is not being equal. They're the two things. And this talking about thrusting aside of the alien, I'm like, okay, that's people of color, that's people with disabilities, that's LGBTQIA identifying people. There's a systematic sense of sin that God is really focused on here. And I would love to hear the church preaching far more about that than about the individualization of sin that comes out of me, as opposed to sin that needs to come out of our culture and out of our church and out of our country and out of our world.
Thank you. I think you know what I think a lot of us recognise, in that sense of reducing purity, reducing Christian faithfulness to sort of individual piety. V does want to come back and just reference, she says in the comment, it's not just the Western culture though. She says, my parents are from Ghana and purity in their culture is often linked to not having sex or smoking, etc.
Again, colonialism missionaries have taken that and done so much to distort and pollute our, I'm Ghanaian as well, like our traditional, and again, like when you come in with a colonialist eye and you come in with this Western imperialism of we have interpreted the truth of Jesus, and our way is the only way. And now, particularly in Ghana and other countries, you've got a lot of American missionaries, prophets, self-proclaimed prophets, and TV evangelists coming out and really doing this purity culture and this prosperity gospel. And this individualization of it is really quite scary to see. So I feel like the Church of England could have a real voice in rectifying that if they speak up.
Yeah, and maybe reclaiming some of this and reclaiming some of these scriptures and what they're really saying. Again, in the comments, people are really picking up on the fact that these are relational things that God is sort of judging against, isn't it? It's how people are impacted. I just want to try, I'm going to bring you in, Kat, in a second, if you want to just like go, okay, I'm coming in with this. But let me just say, so Rachel says, purity is so often linked to bodily stuff by modern Christianity rather than ethics, which is wildly frustrating and weaponizes shame. There's a whole nother conversation to do on that. Who else I need to bring in here? Michelle says, so true, Natalia and Nana, our idea of purity is so individualistic, but all the things listed in verse 5 are things that hurt, trick, or cheat others, and how you can harm community life, which I think is some of the thread of where we've sort of been going with this. Kat, when you read this, were some things that we've already said that have sparked for you, or were you going in a different direction?
I mean, how do I follow that? That's what really stood out to me from that passage is the words defraud, oppress, and deprive, and that massively shouted to me of systemic oppression, and just the systemic injustices and all of that has just made our lives and our communities and our relationships with one another such a mess in so many ways, in the UK and across the world. And I was thinking recently, so there was, some of you might have seen an article in the Leicester Diocese Dio Mail recently about the modern slavery in Leicester. And here in our city, there's like 10,000 people, approximately 10,000 people working in exploitative conditions here in Leicester. And just the journey, all of those journeys, all of those stories, and how that connects up with the way that we as society choose to live and choose to shop and choose to just the things that we choose not to question, and the things that we spend our time on and get het up about, that is just so far removed from what God was crying out about in this powerful passage. And it's sorry, I'm getting a bit emotional just thinking about this, but like, how do we take this passage and speak out, and what does it take for us as Church of England and as society and as community to make those changes around systemic oppression and injustice that we see every day, and that divide us so deeply. That's what really stood out to me from the passage.
I bring your emotion, Kat, bring your emotion. I think, scripture should stir us, shouldn't it? And I think some of the task of the preacher is to take us into this in a way that really connects with our ordinary life. And I'm reflecting back on what we said earlier about the Luke passage. This is an ordinary family. And then those words, that come about Jesus, that this is going to be he's going to cause the rising and the falling of many. That, if you bring these words of justice, of righteousness, it's going to have an impact, and it has to impact us, doesn't it? Not just an ancient people, or not just sort of powers that be. So I just want to give you a chance just to reflect back if there's anything you kicked us off on this, and then anything else that you wanted to just reflect on with this passage.
Yeah, I think there were two things really. One is that whole Fuller's beating and that whole experience of being purified or beaten. It seems to me that this whole thing isn't just for us as individuals, it's for us as a church at the moment. We've got a chance now, through whatever's happening, and us as a nation, to make something different, or we can just let it get worse. But I think that process can make us into better people and better communities as well. And I think the other thing, the promise of the passage as well, is that the reason it's been set, I presume, for this day, is that promise that actually the Lord is coming to the temple. But when they read the passage, they didn't see a baby. They saw, some great warrior or something, that God comes, but it sometimes comes in ways completely unexpected to how we envisaged. So that's a sort of look out for the unexpected kind of warning as well, I think, in there.
Yeah. Thank you. We could say more, but let's just allow the other passage to speak into these three. The other passage today is from Hebrews. Hebrews, it's a little bit of Hebrews, isn't it, near the beginning? I can't find it. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 to 18. I think if I've got that right. Natalia, Nana, you were going to get the ball rolling on this for us. Tell us about this passage. Tell us what you like about it. What's stirring in your spirit on this one today?
Yeah, I really love this this New Testament passage. I love how incarnational it is. One of my bugbears is how we sort of so often in church talk about the incarnation as this supernatural, almost ethereal, Gnostic experience of like it's God's in a body, but it's not really a body because he's God, and it's still this sort of, you know, pious. It's Jesus, the Jesus walking on water rather than the Jesus using the toilet. I love how incarnational this is. Of it's straight up there. It's like, okay, there's flesh, there's blood. He shared the same things. And we've also then seen a parallel of that if he's presented in the temple as a baby, and everyone knows what babies go through. And we can talk about his vulnerability. I'm like, yeah, and let's also talk about his embodiedness. He would have lost his baby teeth. He would have screamed through the night when he had a snotty nose, and Mary back then, most likely before you had what is called suction, would have used her mouth and sucked the snot out of his nose, as you have to do with babies when they can't breathe. That's what it means to be incarnate. That's what it means for my God to have a body. I love that. I love the fact that it says he had to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect. In every respect. He's experienced the whole plethora, the whole multitude of human emotions, of feeling annoyed, of all these negative, what we'd label in England as negative emotions, of, you know, the non-pious, non-pure ones. Like Jesus had a temper, people. He kicked people out of the temple. Ratted, he called the disciples fools. Idiots, how long must I put up with you? He got pissed off. And I love that this really is a reminder about actually how human Yeshua was. I find that's much easier to relate to him as being both God and human. And I also love the fact when it's talking about, you know, he made the sacrifice of atonement. And yes, you know, that would be many other sessions about what atonement actually means. I personally don't take it as just, oh, atonement equals he's paid the price for your sins, so therefore you can receive salvation, whatever that means, when you die. I'm like, no, my salvation starts now. It starts now. I'm being constantly saved. I'm being constantly refined. I'm being constantly made more and more into myself. I'm constantly growing in my understanding of God. That is my ongoing salvation. We're saving, you know, economic and social injustice systems. That is salvation to me right now, right here. It's embodied. And finally, I love the part where it's sort of saying, yeah, he's tested by what he's suffered. And I just caution that whenever we hear the word suffering in the context of Christ, in the context of Jesus of Nazareth, I should say, we immediately think crucifixion. We immediately think, oh, okay, we mean from Good Friday, from that particular time, maybe from Maundy Thursday, because he was having a bit of a bad night with that Gethsemane weeping and praying and, you know, friends letting him down, had a bit of a bad evening. But we mean that, like, what is that? Probably like a 20-hour period, if that, no, from the evening, about 5 o'clock dusk. Yeah, we mean like about, you know, a 15-hour period. Like, no, he had a whole life of suffering. He may have fancied a girl or guy and they didn't fancy him back. He may have been forced to do chores and he really didn't want to. He may have been rejected from rabbinic school, or had to help his dad out with carpentry, or had an argument with Joseph when he was like, no, I'm going to become a rabbi. What do you mean you're becoming a rabbi? You're a carpenter. Oh, I'm not, Dad, because actually God's called me to be a rabbi. He would have suffered. He would have been sick. He would have been frustrated. He would have suffered a heck of a lot before he got to Maundy Thursday in the year 0, or the year 33, or whatever year it actually was, AD. He would have had a life of suffering, because to be human is to freaking suffer. So I can connect to my savior in any suffering, whether it's I'm really bored of what's on Netflix right now because it's still lockdown and I really miss being able to go to Nando's, or whether the suffering is my close friend has got a cancer diagnosis. Yeah. I hold both of those experiences in the same freaking week. And I know that my Lord can relate to, okay, maybe not Netflix, but still he can relate to all levels of my pain, my suffering, my frustration, because God was human with a capital H. He wasn't cheating.
I love that. And God was human with a capital H, and I love that notion of just unpacking that to be human is to suffer. That is actually the reality of the human condition. And you're quite right. Yeah, in my head, I guess visually, suffering a price, you do think the crucifixion, but actually to be human is to suffer. And I wonder if that is a really powerful sermon to engage with for folks at the minute. I must admit, when I read it, sometimes there is just a verse that leaps out at you, and it was the free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. And I wonder as well at the minute if that, if you have what it means for us to live with no sense of hope. And is there something about preaching a sermon that allows people to connect with Jesus, that lifts them from that slavery of the fear of death and all the little deaths that we're experiencing at the minute? I have just got to tell you that Hannah completely connected with your snotty nose example. Italian Anna, she said, yeah, absolutely did that to her. I think, was it your 3-day-old child did that with her mouth, didn't have the suction gadget. When my children were young, they didn't have a suction gadget. I never did that. We've only got a few minutes left, but let's just see what else we can squeeze out of this. Kat, let me come to you first this time. This passage of Hebrews, where did you go with it when you read it? I think you said you didn't like it, was when we started.
Oh, no, I love it. I just couldn't think of any profound insights into it. Because what stood out to me from the passage was the suffering as well, that the man of sorrows thing, that like he can relate to us in every way because he was fully human. And like, yeah, I find that absolutely immense. And just the sort of visualizing Jesus in sort of the snapshot of his life that we've got in the Gospels, the beautifully incredible, fairly detailed in places snapshot of his life. To me, there seems to be a lot of loneliness in there as well. And thinking Jesus was, he had this close group of friends around him, but his calling was so unique and so different that I can imagine there would have been a lot of struggle of, okay, God, do I really, am I really this? Do I really have to go through this? What does this look like for me? What does this look like for my friends and my family? And this immense pain, knowing that knowing that what he was going to go through was going to massively impact his, the pain of his crucifixion, to use just that example, would have brought immense pain to his family, his friends. And the passage that we looked at in Luke, where it says, and a sword will pierce your soul too, to Mary. And it's like he knew that he was going to go through that, and all along, sort of in his 33 years kind of leading up to that as well, just this growth in self-understanding that he was going through must have been such a painful journey as well as an incredible one. And thinking the loneliness that he must have felt within that at times is something that, like, a lot of people can say, I've heard people say, well, Jesus didn't go through this particular very specific thing that I'm going through, or I feel really alone, but Jesus never had that because he was one with the Father. And, what does that look like for my prayer life and all of that? But Jesus would have had those really tough moments of thinking, I can't connect with God, and what does that mean, and how, what does that mean for me as the Messiah? What is that, and grappling with that must have been just immense. And then this modern narrative, this line, freedom from slavery to fear of death. I've heard that used so many times in the context of, I'm not afraid because God will protect me, because I trust God to protect me. And those words are powerful, but I struggle to understand them sometimes. Like, what is it that we're trusting God to protect us from? God doesn't stop bad things from happening to us. And I was recently reflecting on a friend of mine got COVID really badly. He was in intensive care. He lost his wife during that time as well, and just went through so much. And he was sort of expressing his feelings on Facebook through kind of each day, and just putting little reflections up of how it was. Not when he was in intensive care, because he couldn't do that at that point. But and then afterwards, he was asked to put those reflections together in a book and published it. And it's called Finding Refuge. And I find it really interesting reading it, that at the start, it's like, I trust God, God will protect me, God will bring me through. And it's like, what does that mean? And because he was so confident that almost like all will be well. And by the end, it's like, well, all is not well, and I still trust God. And what does that mean for me? And where is Jesus in this mess? And so the passage kind of reminded me of that. And that's something kind of I'm sitting with and holding on to this week.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. Sue, you in this Hebrews passage, and does it relate to the others, or completely stands alone?
Yeah, I see some of those things in it too. This whole physicality is really important. And I think for me, that aspect, the heresies around in the early church, certainly in the, within the hundreds and 200s, things like docetism, where Jesus wasn't fully human, and the Gnostics. And even these days, people want to spiritualize everything. They want to spiritualize hope after death. They want to spiritualize resurrection and heaven. And the thing for me about this passage is it's hope for the body, not just the soul. It's that ultimate hope is that we will be rebuilt and remade, and death itself will be put to death. That's the ultimate hope in this passage, which is amazing and wonderful for our ultimate healing. And we hold on to that, and we see little glimpses of it sometimes in our current lives, and that's beautiful and lovely, but they're only tiny glimpses, and even our healings are only temporary until we wait for that final healing, when we will be remade and rebuilt, and the world will be rebuilt, and that is exciting. And I think for me, that whole thing about suffering too was really interesting, what Natalia and Kat were saying. And I think there's such a link between suffering and love. And the more people love, the more they suffer when they see other people in pain. And Jesus was an immensely full of love, and so suffered dreadfully seeing other people in pain too. And what that means to us to become more loving people, to become more open to other people's pain in order to stretch out and help them. There's all that promise in there as well, but ultimately it's hope for the body, not just the soul in here, and that's wonderful. That's
I feel like we're just starting, but we kind of have to stop, so we have to land. So I always ask my guests, even if they're not preaching, to imagine themselves into a church that's got these texts and goes, okay, what kind of sermon might you preach this Sunday if you were preaching, because we always preach to a time and context. I'm going to go Kat first. Kat, are you preaching on Sunday? You meet with an online community, don't you? Roots is a very new community, but
yeah, I'm not preaching. But when I come to Ministers' Muse, usually I can see a really clear thread between all three passages, and I can see bits. Certainly, I can see, they're all thinking about what Jesus means and what salvation is, and kind of grappling with that, but all in quite different ways. And so I don't think, if I were preaching, which I'm not, I don't think I'd try and bring in all of them, but I try and sort of bring out particular themes. And I'm really drawn to the Malachi one, and the thing of where God is saying, I'm quick to testify against those who defraud laborers, oppress widows, deprive aliens. And of course that does apply to each of us in the everyday decisions and everyday conversations that we have, and little decisions that we make. But on a bigger societal scale, what does that look like for us as a church? What is the role of the Church of England within that? What is God calling us to be as a people, and to do? And what does that look like in our everyday individual lives as well as collectively? And that's sort of where I'd go with that. The refining fire thing in that passage as well. I love that image. It's kind of scary and beautiful, and this thing of change is painful, transformation is really hard, and the way that God works in our lives sometimes really hurts. But what is the gift and the beauty that God's trying to bring out of the things that we go through? And so, even bringing lockdown into it again, we've all struggled in one way or other with lockdown to different degrees, and struggled in different ways. But what is the gift and the beauty that God is trying to draw out of us through that? And how does that connect to our role in society, and in dismantling the systemic oppression that we see all around us each day? So that's probably where I'd go with it.
I think you have to write that sermon now. I think that
I don't like preaching.
That's going to be your homework. Natalia, Nana, if you were preaching on Sunday and with the lectionary on a Candlemas, what sermon would come forth from you, do you think?
You need to stay on and tell me at the end what Candlemas is, because you didn't tell me. And I'm like,
oh, sorry. It's just the name that it gets given. It's to do with the blessing of candles. Sorry, I forgot about that. But yeah.
Because once upon a time, the church used to bless the entire candles for the year at this point. Because there's a reference to light. Let's bless some candles this week.
Yeah. And then it's to do with the light in the nations.
So they lay hands on the candles. Cool. I love the Church of England. You guys just great. My Church of England is like quite evangelical, so I'm like, and I don't get up at 8 a.m. in the morning for the one where he's wearing the dress. I'm like, okay, I don't know about all the traditional stuff. He's in jeans and t-shirt by the time I get there at 6 o'clock. I would preach about, I'd very much have an incarnation focus, and this sense of, I'd probably link Malachi and Hebrews of this sense of, okay, Yeshua of Nazareth, which I don't think the church preaches about enough, of Jesus of Nazareth is who we actually have. And then, you know, we have the risen Christ for all of a paragraph of some gospels, and not at all in Mark, with the original, like the first gospel. So actually so much of our Christian teaching is on the risen Christ, but actually the gospels are about the human Christ. So the human Jesus, I should say. So I'd love to talk about Emmanuel and link that to the nativity and what it means to be incarnated, and suffering, but definitely suffering not through this Church of England, philanthropic, Victorian. We should suffer with others to help them and to be white saviors and to make it better for them. Like, Jesus never does that. He suffers with people because, as Sue said, to love is to suffer, because the more people I love, the more people I'm going to be impacted by. Their suffering becomes my suffering. He would have lost people before Lazarus. He would have grieved his parents, grandparents, so on. Well, not Mary and so on, but wider community. And we're seeing in the Luke passage how big his community, his family was. It wasn't 2.4 with aunts, uncles. It was huge. So you had more losses. So I think I talk about suffering and how incarnated that is, and how the sense of refining is about becoming more and more about who you're meant to be, and how Jesus can help you be a model for that. And through the suffering process is not your like cross to bear, but it's about becoming more and more your fullness and your depth in Jesus.
Thank you. Sounds like a good sermon. Could bless a candle in there as well. Sue, what about you? Are you preaching this weekend, or might you be?
No, not this weekend. I think for me, actually, this year I'd probably go with the whole light. To be a light to lighten the Gentiles. I'm just thinking of that enlightening. I'm just thinking also about the stuff Natalia and Kat were saying about light actually reveals things. When you put the lights on, you suddenly see all this stuff you've not noticed before. And I wonder if there's something about that in the way the gospel as a whole impacts us and impacts our lives, that sometimes actually that light can be quite glaring and scary and make your eyes hurt or make your eyes water even, and yet you become better people through that. And also this fact that actually this is the first time we hear the bigger story of the gospel being expanded to include the Gentiles, and it's coming, that those words are coming from the very temple itself, and that's exciting too, because we know about the 3 wise men and everything, but in terms of historically how it happened, this probably happened first, because after the Magi visited, they scooted off to Egypt. So that's kind of exciting too. This is it, and it's wider and it's brighter than we've previously thought. So that's probably what I preach.
Thank you. And very quickly, I'm not preaching either, because we have we're using Daily Disciples to enter into the story this week, so I don't have to preach, just to tell the story, which is great. If I was writing a sermon, I think I've been so struck by this conversation about to be human is to suffer. And I think I might want to preach into that a little bit, and connecting Jesus's story with our suffering, but also that sense of Mary, actually, because I love Mary's role in this, and the fact that a sword will pierce her soul too. And for me, that kind of brings together all those threads of the things she's been pondering in our hearts. And for us to bring Christ to the world actually can involve the piercing of our souls. I would hope to preach that in an uplifting way, but sometimes we just have to preach how it is, and sometimes how it is the piercing of our souls. On that note, I'm just going to say huge thank you to my guest, Natalia and Nana, to Kat, to Sue, who will be back with me again, I'm sure. And thank you all for joining in. I've not had time to bring in all your comments. They've been having amazing conversations about the humanity of Christ, and to what extent Christ can identify, or Jesus can identify with our experiences. But you've been doing a great job in the comments. I hope you found it helpful, whether you're a preacher or you're on the receiving end of a sermon, or just to help you dive into scripture. Next week, I'm back at the same time with my guest, Father Paul Cartwright, who is definitely the robe-wearing variety, Natalia Nana. He's from the very sort of the Catholic end of the Church of England. David Welsh, who is, I forget his long title, but he does something in Guildford Diocese that's very important that helps keep everyone in the parishes going. He'll probably tell me off describing him like that. And the Reverend Sue Willits, who is a local vicar here in Loughborough, not far from where I am, who is so dedicated to her flock, that who are not very sort of into the internet, that since lockdown last year she has been writing weekly sermons for her folk, and I just think she does an amazing job. So anyway, that's my guest next week. Thank you to you all for being with us today, and I hope that you will find the light of Christ in whatever you are doing this coming week.